Okay, hi everyone. So this week we're going to be talking about an event that happened 8,200 years before present, and I'll talk about the specific dating things in just a second. This is about 6,250 BC or BCE, before Common Era. This was something that happened in Canada, and it affected a large part of Europe and the Middle East. And so I just want to talk about that as a good starting point for leading into the Neolithic, which is what we will talk about next week. And I also want to focus a little bit about this natural climate change event and what it did to early human cultures. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about the time that we're talking about. So as you're reading through some of the papers for this class, you'll notice that they date things a little bit differently. So you'll see some of the dating in some of the scientific papers as BC and AD. So BC is commonly called before Christ. It's a Christian dating system. And then AD, even though a lot of people say after death, it's Anno Domini. It's a Latin phrase meaning in the year of our Lord. So BC are the years before the birth of Christ, typically called 0, which is probably unlikely, but AD is after the birth of Christ. So we're in 2021, so it's 2021 years after the birth of Christ. Now you'll also see another dating system, which is BCE and CE. So BCE is before Common Era. I'll tell you right now, it was designed to get away from the religious dating system, but it's exactly the same. So BCE is exactly the same as BC. CE is Common Era. So, and CE is the same as AD. So right now it's 2021 AD and 2021 CE. Now the one you may not be so familiar with is BP, which is before present. So this was a dating system that started in the 1950s when carbon dating got a start. So now what's kind of odd about this, and that it's odd that people are still using it, is that before present is not before 2021, it's 1950. So for that particular dating system, present is 1950. So I have a little calculation here for you to think about when you're thinking about converting BP, before present dates, to BC or BCE. So 8200 before present event is 8200 minus 1950, so about 6250 BC. So it's something to think about. Don't get confused on your dating systems. If you're reading a paper on before present, you have to think about that. About 2,000 years you're subtracting from that to get it to BC. Anyway, so just be sure you're thinking about that. Okay, so I also found this slide in a journal. It's called Mediterranean Land Use by Weiberg, and I've given you a bibliography. You can find this article if you want to really look into it. But the reason I put it up here is because it shows the difference between BP. Let me maybe change the color of this to red. So this is BP, before present, and then up at the top, it's BC. Whoops, that doesn't help either. Oh, I'll just switch it back to yellow. Anyway, so what you've got here is 7,000. Whoops, not very straight. 7,000 before present is, I don't know, well, whatever that is. Sorry, you'll have to do the calculation. But that shows you a way to verify these things. So maybe this one's easier for me because I can't do math in my head. 6,500 before present is not quite 4,500 or 4,600 BCE. Anyway, this was just put up just for you to see the comparisons of the dating systems. Okay, so for this week, I've given you an article to read. It's titled The 8200 Calendar BP, Abrupt Environmental Change and the Neolithic Transition, a Mediterranean Perspective. So it's a paper that's I don't want to say fairly scientific, but it's not your typical history paper. So what it does is it gives a summary of a lot of different data from various studies in Europe, North America, and the Near East. And what they ended up doing is taking all this different data, putting it together, and then extrapolating out their results. So just when you're reading this, don't get bogged down in the details. There are a lot of details in that paper. Now, some of these you can use for your podcasts, but don't get bogged down in the detail. Don't get depressed when you're reading this. If you don't understand everything, it's okay. I just want you to get the gist of the article. And my advice when you start to read this article is to look at the abstract. So the abstract is at the very beginning, and it gives you a rundown of what the paper is about. So read that first. Then in this particular paper, there's an introduction and a problem statement. So read that. Then go to the discussion, which is towards the end. You'll skip all the data. Read the discussion, read the conclusion. Try and get an understanding of what's happening in the article. Then go back and read the whole thing. So that's probably the best way to start attacking these articles if you haven't read sort of scientific history articles before. And I put a note here, make sure you look at the excellent bibliography in this article and all the rest of them, because this is where you're going to go to find your sources for your other assignments. Okay, before we get to what the 8,200 before present event is, you'll see various terms throughout these articles. Now, in Blackboard, I've started a list of terms or definitions. So I'll make it a Google Doc, because as I see new ones, I'll start popping up in there. But just a few that I pulled out from this article, you may not be familiar with if you haven't taken a class in the ancient world before. So you'll see abbreviations like PPNB. So sometimes, hopefully, they'll describe it the first time they mention it, but it's Pre-Pottery Neolithic B. So PPNB. And what this is the Neolithic, and we'll talk about this, is a time where people are doing agriculture. So Neolithic A is an earlier time period. And then you move to Neolithic B. Now, in Neolithic B at the very beginning, you don't have any pottery. So you find evidence of farming, but you find no evidence of pottery. So it's called pre-pottery. So before pottery, Neolithic B, PPNB. So a stage where there's no pottery. Now later you're going to move to Neolithic A, where they have pottery, and Neolithic B, where they definitely have pottery. Another term you'll see is anthropic. So this relates to people, and this is a term that we use when we're talking about philanthropy and so on. Another word you'll see mentioned in this article is karst. So this is a type of stone. It's an area of limestone where, if you know anything about limestone, it's fairly soft. So when it rains a lot over time, or if there's a river running over it, you'll get the stone breaks up. And so you can get sinks where the water sort of sinks down, or ravines, like, think of the Grand Canyon. That's not a ravine, but it's a canyon, but same idea. And then you also get underground streams flowing through it. And then you also get a term called taphonomy. So I put a couple different definitions here. So the study of the events or processes that affect the remains of an organism after it dies. So when you're thinking about fossil remains or remains of anything, it's the process that got it there. And then it's also the events that lead up to the preservation of fossils. So if you've got, say, massive amounts of erosion because of a hill the trees were removed, how did animals get caught in all of that down at the bottom? So that's a little bit of what taphonomy is. Okay, now the 8200 before present event. So this is an event that started in Canada. So about 6250 BC. And what they think happened is that this lake, one of the largest lakes in Canada, either broke through its banks, or it broke through underground caverns. Now they're not quite sure, and then flooded part of the eastern part of Canada, and this massive amount of water, fresh cold water, went into the Atlantic. And so the Atlantic is obviously salty. Sorry, my cat's in the background. It's salty, so high salinity. You get fresh water with very low salinity, and they mixed. And of course, you got the very cold water mixing with the cold water of the Atlantic. Now, this changed a lot of things. It changed the salinity of especially the deeper parts of the ocean, where you get different flows, slower flows, faster flows. This really affected that. And then it also affected the surface of the ocean, which then affected the weather. So it affected the climate. So this event started in Canada, but affected Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East because of what was happening there. So this is a natural phenomenon. We're not exactly sure what led to the flooding or what to the collapse of this massive lake, but it led to changes in the Atlantic Ocean, especially affected the northern hemisphere. Now, we'll look at some of this, but what you get are very dry conditions in the Middle East. So where Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, that's the Middle East. You get less rain there. In Western and Central Europe, it gets wetter and colder. Now think about people who are living there, which is the whole point of this. People in this area are moving into the Neolithic. Now some of them are already in the Neolithic, where they're already farming, especially in the Middle East. But in Europe, they're just moving into this. They're learning how to farm, plant plants, domesticate animals, and then the weather gets cooler and wetter. That makes it very difficult to grow certain types of crops. Another big change that happened in Europe is air temperatures dropped. This was a massive amount. They dropped by 6 degrees plus or minus 2, meaning it could be 8 degrees or it could be 4 degrees. And then we know that snow accumulation dropped by 20%. So we live in California, and you know how dependent we are on snowfall for a lot of our water. So think about having the amount of snow drop by a big percentage like this. There's going to be less water. And of course, that affects farming and so on. This led to something called climatic irregularity in the Mediterranean basin. So the Mediterranean basin, and I probably should have put a map here, where we've got the Mediterranean Sea, you've got Italy, Turkey, the Near East, you've got Egypt, and then North Africa. That's all part of this Mediterranean basin. So it affected that area in particular. And the question is, for scholars who are looking at this 8200 before present event, how did it affect the transition between the Mesolithic, which is a time period where they're not quite farming, they're still hunter-gatherers, the people, and then the transition into the Neolithic, which is farming. And then this leads to another question that you sometimes get in articles and books. Is society the change for the Neolithic development, or is the climate the trigger for a Neolithic development? Meaning, people who are living, how did they discover how to farm? Or is it something they're sort of forced to do because the climate changes? So, and one thing that you need to be aware of is that what's happening in the North Atlantic and in Canada is definitely affecting what's happening in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. So it's a pretty amazing event in terms of being able to talk about it and how it might affect people. So I've got a chart here, and I think what I might do is make a separate video on how to read some of these things in more detail. But what you've got here is the time frame. So this time frame starts at 7500 BC, even though the whole article is in before present, and then moves up to a more present time of 5500 BC. Now this right here is the event we're talking about. Let me see if I can get my pen to do something smaller. So the 8200. So about this period is when the climate in Europe got cooler and wetter, and in the Middle East it got drier. So now okay, we've got the time frame. Now what this article is doing is it's picking out specific geographical areas and figuring out what's happening. So in 7500 BC, you've got the late PPNB, so pre-pottery Neolithic B. They have pottery. Going into about 7000, it's the late period, and then they move into another period. Now, this area doesn't show, it does show some change because farming is starting to change, and then they move into this during this period of 500 years. Now, what we want to concentrate on is this, where you've got all these question marks that seem to center around 8200 before present event. So in Cyprus, for example, you've got this culture during the about 7500 BC. And then you've got something called the aceramic gnosis. So gnosis is on the island of, let me move back here. You've got this culture. Then during this period, there's not a lot of evidence for things that are happening. So if you look through like the Neolithic sites, it looks like maybe people have moved away or there's no farming. And it continues. And then, now let's go to Crete. So where you've got the famous Minoans. So between 7000 BC and 6500 BC, you've got something called aceramic gnosis. Aceramic means no ceramics, no pottery. So A is something called the alpha primitive, and it means the negative. So if it's ceramic, you've got ceramics, meaning pottery. Aceramic means no pottery. And then you have like a blank in the archaeological record. And then same thing for all these other places, and they just happen to correspond to this 8200 before present event. So clearly the weather is affecting how people are moving into the Neolithic, where they're moving from not farming to farming. But this cold, wet period is affecting that. Okay, and you can look at other studies, and like I said, I will put up a bibliography for all of this, but there's an article called Climate Forcing Due to the 8200 Calendar Year BP Event. And then what they show is that farmers are probably moving about pretty quickly. So, and if you think about it, if you're a farmer and you're growing food, and there's a population of people dependent on you, and then your weather changes, what are you going to do? People don't tend to sit down and just die. They get up and they move away. And so this particular research found that lots of the sites were just abandoned soon after this event, and then the farmers went elsewhere. And there's another study that shows that farmers were moving from the Middle East into Europe about this time. Okay, there's also in this article called Climate Forcing, you have a couple of charts here. And these are similar charts to what I showed you, they just present the data a little bit differently. So here is the calendar, the 8200 BP event. So it ranges in here. And what they've done here is they've placed the civilizations they're looking at, the Neolithic sites, here instead of along the top. And so what they're showing here, for example, and these are carbon dating. So they're looking at everything in the site that's been carbon dated. Let's look at some obvious ones where something is probably happening. So in Cyprus, you see an increase in the number of items that have been carbon dated, meaning people are around, they're making things and so on. The 8200 BP event happens and you see a decline. And in fact, it almost gets erased, and then you see a little bit of an uptick with the number of items that have been carbon dated. So something happened in this society that seemed to be triggered by that cold weather event. Cyprus. So we just looked at another article. This is just another way to look at the data. They have a slight uptick at the end of the 8200 event, and then they go down as well. And then this society, Cthulhuc, a very famous Neolithic site, they start declining a little bit before, and it's one of the things that might be happening here is that they may be getting colder a little bit earlier before this event, and then when the big event hits, it pretty much wipes them out. Same here, you see a steady decline, pretty steep decline. Now, at this particular site in Turkey, you see something else. So they actually get a start, an uptick, when you've got the 8200 before present event. So there's always exceptions, and it's those exceptions that you really have to think about, like what's happening here. Were they protected? Were they in a protected area? And so on. And then I won't go through all of this, but it's the exact same example. You see this in Greece, a decline. Another one in Greece, and they do start up later, but then they decline again, and decline, decline, Not so much of a decline, but you still see it, and then decline. So all of these sites are definitely affected by this particular event. Okay, other studies. One that came out in 2004 looked at what was happening in Central America. And what they found is that the 8200 before present event didn't just affect Europe and the Mediterranean. It definitely affected things that were happening in Costa Rica. And what they ended up doing is they measured data from stalagmites. So they found these in a cave where it's where the water drips down onto the ground and then they start building up. You can slice through those, or slice through this way, sorry, and you can go that way, and to figure out what was happening. And so what they found is that you get reduced rainfall and weaker monsoons, which are like massive rainstorms that come. And so this was definitely affecting things in Central America as well as Europe and the rest of the Mediterranean. I've given you a few more sites. There are tons of research on this particular article. So this one, the climactic event in the process of neolithization, this is farming. So what you see is it's colder in the northern hemisphere, which is what we looked at. Lower pollen levels for certain trees, meaning the trees are probably having a hard time reproducing with the colder weather. Tree rings in Germany are smaller. So tree rings, like when you've got a large area or large tree rings, the tree is growing a lot. So it's probably very good conditions for it. When they get smaller, something is happening to make the tree grow slower. So you see this correspond to this particular event. And then they also said that it looks like there's evidence that farmers are moving from Asia to Europe looking for better conditions. One exception to this, where you've got a study from Mesolithic Norway, or on Mesolithic Norway. It looks like this particular event didn't have too much impact on people living on the coast, and the authors think it's probably because they had access to marine foods. So even though the temperature might have got colder, they are still fishing. So it may not have affected marine life. In fact, what they showed, if you end up reading this particular article, is that this might have been good for some marine life. So more marine life, the people are fishing more, their populations are remaining stable. So it didn't affect everyone in the same way. And then we've looked at this in terms of the sources for information. This is just a reminder. We've got pollen studies. We've got charcoal we can look at for the way that people are using wood. Of course, we've got archaeology, the human remains of towns and villages and so on. And then again, remember what these limits can tell us. Got 2 more slides. Okay, what are the lessons here? So again, I talked about this last week. We always have to think about how we can use this information. So one of the lessons is that something happens a long ways away can affect somewhere else. So we've got a flood of a massive lake in Canada that affects the Atlantic Ocean, that then affects the weather in Europe and the Middle East. And it goes as far away, we can look at more data from India. So there's lots of lessons here. What happens in one place far away can certainly affect a local area pretty far away. And then we also see in terms of the lessons, climate can definitely affect communities. So in this case, we're looking at Neolithic communities who are just moving into farming, and it definitely affects what they were doing. So what we know is that people ended up moving away to what they hoped would be better areas. And the interesting thing about this is, as these farmers are moving, they might be teaching people who are living in these areas how to farm. So it could have been like a knowledge spreading event, even though they were fleeing bad weather. And then finally, you have to remember the exceptions. So in Norway, it may not have affected them very much just because they were so tied into eating a diet from the sea. And so this weather event probably didn't affect them as much as, say, someone living on the continent or living in the Middle East.